first speaker is Mattson. He's there at the back, and he's going to come up any second. He's a lawyer who has helped prosecute major cases of industrial pollution. And after 10 years in the courtroom, he decided to devote even more of his time to developing institutions that will restore and protect watersheds for generations to come. He founded Lake Ontario Waterkeeper in 2001 and remains the organization's full-time Waterkeeper and president. Mark's love of water stems from his childhood summers swimming and fishing on Wolf Island near Kingston. He is going to talk to us about the state of the lakes. Welcome.
Thank you, Alana, and thank you, Tara and Tracy, and everyone who's here this morning. It's a beautiful day out there, and it's always a great privilege to come down to Toronto's waterfront. Many people in Toronto forget what a great place Toronto's waterfront truly is, and Tracy, I think, mentioned the wave deck over in the corner here. Lake Ontario Waterkeeper's offices were just across the little harbor there, across the bridge, and there's a big pipe in the corner under the wave deck. It's called a CSO, Combined Sewer Overflow. And so I was just preparing some notes to speak to you this morning, sitting on the wave deck, when, to my horror, the pipe started belching out sewage. So if you go over there this morning, you'll see the little ducks floating in with the floating condoms and tampon applicators and needles floating around the harbor. And I quickly tweeted off a message to the City of Toronto and talked to the contractors who were there, who are sucking up the garbage from the CSOs, and I guess they accidentally pushed it through. But it reminds me, when we talk about, really coming here this morning, when we talk about the state of the Great Lakes, there are some really great stories, and there are some really horrific stories. There's a positive narrative that many of you are part of, and there's a negative narrative that goes back long before probably many of you were born, and we all hear about over and over. And we talk about it as where the lakes were in the 50s and the 60s, and the death of Lake Erie, and the building of sewage treatment plants, and a renewal even here in Toronto. And I'm going to talk a bit about that, but I just want to start by talking a bit about my experience with Lake Ontario and what I do. So I'm president of Lake Ontario Waterkeeper, and I'm the Waterkeeper. And Waterkeepers were born out of the 60s on the Hudson River, where the Hudson River Keeper was the first person really to stand and say that they were going to enforce the laws and the rules on the river, and they were going to speak for the river. And that organization, through John Cronin, ultimately has now spawned over 280 waterkeepers in the world. We're one of them, Lake Ontario Waterkeeper. And there are 9 in Canada. I'm on the board of 5 of them. And we're growing. It's a tough job, though, because there isn't funding for it. It's not a government job. It's a charity. You need to build a community of people who share your values. And there isn't really a blueprint for what someone who is a full-time activist on a waterfront or water body does. So even here in Toronto and on Lake Ontario, I had to define what that position would be about. As Alana said, I'm a practicing lawyer. I was a criminal lawyer. And in the early 90s, I helped prosecute for the Ministry of Environment with an old friend named Doug Chapman, who was at Sierra Legal Defense Fund, now Equal Justice. And he and I had a small practice, and we were asked to prosecute some environmental offenses in the early 90s. And as a criminal lawyer, I knew about the courts. I knew about evidence, burden of proof. I knew that going into the provincial courts, we'd bring the evidence forward, there'd be a transparent public hearing, independent decision making, and there'd be penalties once conviction. Those penalties would be specific deterrence and general deterrence. And it seemed pretty clear to me when I looked at the environmental laws that we'd always have swimmable, drinkable, fishable water here in Ontario because the laws were so strict. You couldn't deposit a deleterious substance into waters frequented by fish, the Fisheries Act. Section 36.3 says. If you do, you can be fined up to $1 million a day or 6 months in jail. The Ontario Water Resources Act fines up to $6 million a day and 6 months in jails for rendering water unfit for human consumption. There were environmental assessment hearings that if they were public lands, and I spoke to the Council of Canadians last year in Hamilton, Toronto, and Kingston, and we did the public trust doctrine series that Maud led across the Great Lakes, and I was lucky enough and privileged enough to speak at 3 of them. And when you're dealing with public lands or waters, the government had an obligation to hold a hearing and give the public an opportunity to come forward and look at alternatives. So it wasn't just what the proponent wanted to build, whether it was an airport and jets. There'd always be the opportunity of the public to say, well, look, at those are public lands, wouldn't that make a nice park? For example, the Toronto Waterfront. The cleanest beaches in all of Toronto are Gibraltar and Hanlon's beaches right there. The only reason why we don't have access to them, and it takes us over an hour to get to those beaches, is because there's an airport in between. Wouldn't it be nice to think that Toronto would use these public lands as park space, as beachfront, as waterfront? What other city on the Great Lakes has its cleanest swimmable water within 10 minutes of its downtown? But if we don't have environmental assessments, we don't have the Fisheries Act or Navigable Waters Protection Act, which has now been rolled back as well, that would have required a hearing if you're going to fill in the lake and it's going to affect navigation, then you don't ask those questions. So when I started as a lawyer, I thought, geez, we have great laws, great processes, and if we give them meaning and force, we're going to have swimmable, drinkable, fishable water. And what I found over the 90s and before I started Waterkeeper was that these laws were slowly being lost and rolled back. And that acceleration of losing those rights has now reached the highest speeds of all. And I'm sure you're all hearing about that from the federal government in the last few years, and here even in Ontario. The hearings that I started in the early 90s, environmental assessment hearings into landfills, timber, even nuclear power plants, have disappeared. Ontario hasn't had an Environmental Assessment Act hearing. We have environmental assessment reviews, but a hearing that I know of in over 13, 14 years, and I think I would know about it if we had one. Federally, the Navigable Waters Protection Act rollbacks eliminated over 3,000 environmental reviews for impediments in our waters. The Fisheries Act rollback took away the rights to every single water body protection of deleterious substance or loss of fish habitat. So now, and I saw this coming before I started Waterkeeper, I really saw the idea that if we don't have full-time advocates who are standing up and really getting involved in giving meaning and force to the laws and getting out there and meeting the people on our lakes and understanding where the pipes are and where the threats are and speaking to them, much like the Council of Canadians is doing now, then we're going to lose swimmable, drinkable, fishable water. And so that's what I was asked to talk about today, really, was have we lost it? Do we still have it here on the Great Lakes? What is the state of the Great Lakes? And I'll put to you that really it is in the eye of the beholder, the Great Lakes, because when I grew up down on Wolf Island, there was a commercial fishery. There were still eels in Lake Ontario. They used to ball up at night, and as kids we'd go out with a flashlight to look at them. 50% of Lake Ontario's biomass used to be an American eel, which comes from the Sargasso Sea, as most of you probably know, and is one of the most amazing fish in the world. They're almost all lost now in Lake Ontario as a result of dams and pollution on the lake. Can they be restored? Like that. The eel still lives in most of the rivers and watersheds on the east coast of the United States. They'd all come back into Lake Ontario again. We could restore them, but do we have the will? It's a good question. The beaches. Lake Ontario Waterkeeper keeps track of all 189 beaches on Lake Ontario now. We have a free swim guide app. We actually keep track of water quality beaches across North America. But here on Lake Ontario, the beaches, for the most part, 30% of them are closed. We only have 189. 30% of them are closed if you showed up at a beach on Lake Ontario at any time during this summer. Closed. In other words, it's bacteria that's getting into the water. That's sewage, stormwater. If we stopped it, it wouldn't be there tomorrow. It wouldn't be there the day after. The bacteria dies very quickly. We all know bacteria lives inside the mammals' insides. It doesn't live out in the lake for very long. If we stop polluting the Don and the Humber tomorrow and Duffin's Creek and Petticoat Creek, we'd be able to swim in them within a week. These beaches are replaceable. We can restore them. What about fish habitat? Lake Ontario's lost 65% of its nearshore habitat in the last 50 years. Cities have filled in creeks and marshes and landfills, filled in lake like they're proposing to do again here to build a runway. We've pretty well stopped that, but we haven't gone back and fixed the mistakes we've made. We're starting, positive news again, Randall Reef in Hamilton. The government's talking about containing that toxic polyaromatic hydrocarbon reef that came out of the steel factories. Port Hope, over $1 billion was added to the cleanup in Port Hope last year. It didn't make the newspapers. A town of 18,000 on Lake Ontario, the federal government put another $1 billion into cleaning it up. That's $1.2 billion in the next 5 to 10 years to clean up the radioactive waste left in that town. We can clean up Port Hope Harbor again, and we will. But we don't want to make those mistakes again, and people have to remember where those billions of dollars are coming from. And that these are mistakes that have been made, and we need to fix them if we want swimmable, drinkable, fishable water again. Do we want to have a fishery on Lake Ontario again? Can anybody tell me another freshwater lake as great as Lake Ontario? Over 200 square kilometers of water out there that has no fishery? The 9 million people who drink from it get no food from it? Could you imagine if that was a field and we pointed out to a field? It would be like being in Chernobyl and pointing out a 200 square kilometer field and saying no one eat any food from that field. It would be a world stain, a disaster, and yet we live right here on Lake Ontario and get no food from our lake. The St. Lawrence market, that many of you might have gone to this morning or walked by, has no food in its fishery, in its fish coolers from Lake Ontario. Every other Great Lake does, of course. Could Lake Ontario have fish again? Of course. St. Lawrence Market was built there for the boats in Toronto to come up to and take its fish and provide food and nutrition. And do the birds that fly through, the migratory birds, still rely on those fish? Yes. Does the ecosystem still rely on those fish? Yes. And I think as Canadians and Ontarians in Toronto, if we want a lake that we're proud of, we need to have a fishable lake.